Welcome to all participants to this important webinar. And also a special thanks to all of our guest speakers from around the world, and especially our guest speaker, Ambassador Zelmy Maria Domínguez from Greece, actually, Cuban ambassador to Greece. My name is Bahman Azad. I'm the coordinator of the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Military Bases and also Executive Secretary of the U.S. Peace Council. We have organized this webinar jointly with the World Peace Council and Coalition Against Foreign Military Bases, U.S. Foreign Military Bases, to honor and respect, to commemorate the 100th, I think, 4th anniversary on the February 23rd of the U.S. illegal occupation of Guantanamo, Cuba. In November 2018, we held an international conference in Dublin, Ireland, again jointly organized by World Peace Council and the Coalition Against Foreign Military Bases, and hosted by Peace and Neutrality Alliance of Ireland, at which we had a final resolution calling for declaring the February 23rd as the day of international action against the US NATO military bases. So this webinar is actually to commemorate that date. Since then, of course, the situation in the world has really worsened. We know with the Trump administration, a lot of crisis developed internationally. The Cold War with China and Russia is intensifying. In the Middle East, the question of Palestine, Iran, and Syria is becoming more tense. In Latin America, now we are facing the westward expansion of NATO after the eastward expansion before. Now Colombia is partly integrated into NATO, and the US is planning to bring in more forces, more countries into that scene. And also we're talking about Africa Command that is expanding in Africa. So the whole situation is getting much worse. And I think we are very honored and lucky to have all of these prominent speakers from all around the world, from all 5 continents, to bring us up to date about what is happening with these situations, especially bases in those areas. We are honored to have 6 speakers, actually 7. I will go over the list in terms of order that we are presenting our speakers. On Latin America and Caribbean, Carolus Wimmer from COSI-Venezuela. Then Iraklis Tsavdaridis from Greece, World Peace Council will speak about the European situation. Then we have from Asia Pacific, Bimal Ratnayaka. And then on Africa, we have Margaret Kimberly, who's going to join us a bit later. And finally, on the US foreign policy and under Biden administration, we have Roger Harris from the United States. And at the end, we have our guest speaker, Ambassador Zelmys Domínguez Cortina, Cuban ambassador to Greece, to speak about the Cuban situation. This will be followed by a question-answer period, which will be moderated by my dear comrade and friend, Margaret Flowers. Before we start, I have to mention a couple of points, or a few more important points. One, each speaker is allocated 10 minutes, so I'm going to ask all of our speakers to maintain that 10-minute limit, and because we have many speakers, and then we want to leave some time for question-answer period. And also, since our speeches and the presentations are being translated simultaneously, I'm going to ask all of the speakers to please speak slowly and clearly so that our interpreters can follow you. After all presentations, as I mentioned, we have our Q&A period. Margaret will be moderating that. So what I'm going to ask you to is to put your questions in the Q&A section and not in the chat section, because they will get lost in the middle of ongoing chat messages. So without taking more time, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Comrade Carolus Wimmer, President of Committee for International Solidarity and Struggle for Peace, COSI-Venezuela. Comrade Carolus. Speaker, please. Microphone.
Okay, I'm ready. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Venezuelan International Solidarity and Peace Committee, COSI, I welcome all the speakers and the comrades and friends worldwide. We thank the Presidency of the World Peace Council for the honor to be invited in the International Day of Action against US and NATO military bases. Our committee, COSI, celebrates in April 2021 its 50th anniversary, always dedicated to the international solidarity, the defense of human rights and peace. This includes the fight against the nuclear weapons, the arms of mass destruction, and of course, the fight against the presence of US and NATO military bases in our countries. At this moment, people are asking themselves, what can the world and the peace movement expect as a new US president takes office? For this purpose, we analyze the recently organized 57th Munich Security Conference 2021 with the hypocritical and lying motto, peace through dialogue. And three conclusions could be taken away. The first, North America and Western Europe want to repower the imperialist war machine and want to coordinate more closely again in the power struggle against Russia and China in the coming years. To proceed shoulder to shoulder, as European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen put it. The transatlantic alliance is back, declared US President Joseph Biden, while German Chancellor Angela Merkel promised that Germany stands ready for a new chapter in the transatlantic partnership. Together we represent a formidable and influential power. EU Council President Charles Michel boasted, and von der Leyen added that revival of the old transatlantic pact was a signal to the world. Yes, a signal of war. Yes, a signal of Cold War. Second conclusion, there were loud boasts of unity. That's what you let loose when you want to scare the enemy and close your own ranks. And it's true, no one should underestimate the West's potential to use brute force. All too many countries, from Iraq to Libya, from Iran to Cuba and Venezuela, can sing a bitter song about it. But even at the Munich conference, the transatlantic differences could not be completely concealed. Also, for the first time, only politicians from the USA, Canada, and Western Europe were invited. We must counter the threat from Russia, Biden demanded. Merkel agreed that it was urgent to develop a common transatlantic agenda on Russia, but then immediately demanded that it should also include cooperative efforts. Transatlantic coordinator Peter Bayer rudely recalled that Biden was still not lifted Trump's punitive tariffs against Europe. In the future too, there will always be an alignment of interests, Merkel dryly noted. And the third conclusion, besides proud invocations of alliance and festering dissonance, Biden felt it necessary to emphasize, with regard to the power struggle against China, we can win this race for the future. Being able to win implies that the opposite may just as well happen. An indirect admission that the power struggle could also be lost would have been difficult to imagine from the mouth of a US president just a few years ago. The United States has some 800 military bases around the world, and 76 of these are in Latin America. The history of the military bases built by the US government in Latin America was initially related to the intention of having the presence in face of potentially conflictive and strategic movements for its foreign policy, such as the construction of the Panama Canal, which began in 1903, the independence of Cuba in 1902, and with the Puerto Rico in 1898. Based on these events, this form of protection of US imperialist interests was expressed in the creation of a network of bases in Latin America during the 20th century. Among the best known are 12 in Panama, 12 in Puerto Rico, 9 in Colombia, 8 in Peru, 3 in Honduras, 3 in Mexico, 2 in Paraguay, Guantanamo in Cuba, Argentina, and so on, with the greatest number concentrated in Central America and the Caribbean. In Colombia, 79% of military bases are located where there are illicit coca crops and trafficking routes to the United States. According to the UN World Drug Report 2020, coca cultivation is 70% in Colombian narco state, and manufacture has increased by 5.9% to 1,120 tons. The presence of the US government is a type of intervention that is not only military, but also political, ideological, and economic. And in our capitalist society, characterized by inequality and lack of opportunities, the interventionist presence of the United States through militarization or bases instead of contributing to attacking the roots of violence and inequality is a declaration of war. In March 2018, the US Southern Command released information on its strategy for our region over the next 10 years. Mentioned in this context were Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. The greater presence of China, Russia, and Iran in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as a role assigned to security forces in every country in terms of internal, regional, and international order. The previous commander, Admiral Curtit, explained to the US Congress the scenarios foreseen on the continent, objectives, means, and strategies as outlined in the 2018 National Defense Strategy. He acknowledged that given the geographical proximity, commercial, immigration, and cultural closeness, there's no other part of the world that affects daily life in the United States more than Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. He said that challenges to US hegemony will be confronted via a network of friendly relations operated by the Southern Command in conjunction with US intelligence agencies and allies. 3 joint task forces implement the plan. One called Bravo, based in Sotocano, Honduras, the Guantanamo Task Force, and the Interagency Joint Task Force in Key West, Florida. The planned US response to any contingency included defense of the Panama Canal, immigration control, plus unilateral bilateral and multilateral military operations against our countries. Colombia is a major actor in the region, especially given its new relationship with NATO. Colombia invested the equivalent of 3.1% of the gross domestic product in military expenditures, approximately 9.7 billion US dollars. This country's military budget is the second highest in the region, surpassed only by Brazil. The establishment of the US military base in Neuquén, Argentina, contributes an interesting piece of information. In 2011, the YPF company discovered a giant oil field in Neuquén, and in 2018, the US announced the construction of an air base here. The US has divided the world in 9 commands for its purposes. The Southern Command for Latin America and the Caribbean includes this network of bases, plus the Fourth Fleet, which is itself a series of operative bases with a great geographical range, constituting a serious threat for our countries. The siege is tightening. The war the United States is waging against Venezuela needs regional forces to intervene, not only economically. Simon Bolivar's words seem to take on even greater meaning today. The United States appears to be destined by Providence to plague America with misery in the name of freedom. No more US and NATO military bases. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Carolus. Now, I would like to introduce my dear comrade Iraklis Tsavdaridis, Executive Secretary of the World Peace Council. He will be speaking from Athens. Comrade Iraklis.
Thank you, Comrade Bahman. Dear comrades and friends from the World Peace Council and from the US Coalition Against US Foreign Military Bases. When we took this decision in November 2018 in Dublin to dedicate the 23rd of February every year to the struggle against foreign military bases, and in particular the ones of the US and NATO, which constitute the 95% of the total of the bases, we chose this date because of the emblematic content. It was 118 years ago when the US signed with the bourgeois government of Cuba then the agreement for the use of part of the territory of Cuban province Guantanamo as a naval base by the United States. The 99 years of the agreement included the provision that it can be cancelled only if both parties agree, which means only if the use of only if the US would agree to leave. After the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Cuba never agreed to maintain this agreement, and the Cuban people and government, I repeat, people and government, because it's a unique case, always strongly demanded the return of Cuban territory to its owner and the closure of the US naval base and its respective illegal prison. To this demand, we add strongly our voices, the voices of the hundreds of millions of peace-loving people in the world who are declaring also their solidarity with the island of the revolution, with the socialist Cuba. We are glad today that despite the technical obstacles put in front of Cuba, we have a representative from Cuba with us, with our dear ambassador, Zelmys Domínguez. The dozens of speeches and contributions held in Dublin in 2018 and the respective booklet with the documentation of the first international conference then in Dublin is a rich material reflecting many aspects of the issue of foreign military bases and as an instrument of imperialist domination and interference in domestic affairs and locations, and they constitute locations for the preparations and execution of imperialist wars and aggression against the peoples of the world. The World Peace Council stood always firm on this subject of foreign military bases, denouncing in actions and demonstrations in front of hundreds of bases of the US and NATO in dozens of countries, demanding their closure. At the same time, we always maintain vigilant on the imperialist aggressive plans and wars, whether the military bases are being used for it or not. We are aware that the leading force in this imperialist system, and in NATO in particular, is the USA. Apart from its military strength, its military, navy, air force, the USA relies very much on its network of allies. The European Union and its members, who are by vast majority also NATO members, is a close ally in almost all military endeavors taking place around the world. We are observing that despite the antagonisms between major forces inside NATO, they all share strategic cooperation and go hand in hand when it comes to their fundamental interests against peoples. The European Union is slowly but steadily growing as a military force, aiming in the creation of its own EU army, while it has established battle groups for rapid interventions. It has created a defense agency, and by definition, it speaks about a strategic partnership with NATO, which is clearly declared by the Lisbon Treaty. The European Union applies heavy political and economical sanctions against nations and countries, as it is the case with Venezuela, Syria, Iran, Russia, DPRK, and others. The European Union maintains more than 20 foreign military missions, often labeled as peacekeeping or humanitarian, whereas military bases of NATO or of France in particular are being used. The European Union was never a club of equals, not in any sense. It was never the union of the peoples. It is defending the interests and profits of the multinational corporations, participating in violent regime changes, and applying its so-called democratic standards around the world. The recent example of Venezuela, where the European Union ambassador was expelled for the subversive role of the EU, which EU was performing the last years, speaks for itself. The role of the EU played in the coup d'etat in the Ukraine in 2014 was also very clear. The European Union is a full-fledged imperialist structure. The governments of its member states are bearing all their responsibility for the unanimous decisions they are taking always on all issues. The geographical area of Europe constitutes a theater of military and imperialist interests since ever. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the new members of NATO in Eastern Europe enlarged its range, and for the last 20 years, new military bases were established in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Romania, in Bulgaria, including missile defense shields in Romania and Poland, which would enable NATO to strike first without the possibility for retaliation. Ireland, with its de facto US base in Shannon Airport, has become the transfer hub for 3 million of US troops heading to or returning from military aggressions of the US in the last 20 years. The US maintains as well their airbase in Ramstein, Germany, as a major hub in Europe. Germany is also the place where the African command of the US is based for the US aggressions and surveillance in Africa. After the imperialist aggression of NATO in 1999 in Yugoslavia, NATO has established the biggest foreign military base worldwide on the Serbian territory of Kosovo with under the name Camp Bondsteel. From there, the US and NATO forces control operations for the Balkans and Eastern Europe. But the US has also very reliable partners in Turkey with the airbase of Incirlik, which is hosting, in inverted commas, also nuclear weapons, and in Cyprus, where the United Kingdom maintains military bases within their sovereign bases on the island, which is at the same time partially occupied by a NATO member, Turkey. The importance of Greece for the imperialist plans in the broader area of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea can be easily understood if we look at the bilateral military agreement between the US and Greece, which was prepared by the previous government and is being implemented by the current one in Greece. According to this agreement, several new military bases are being installed by the US in Greece, additional to the strategic Souda base, naval base and air base in Crete, which is being enlarged in its functions. Just these days, a huge military mobilization is taking place by the US at the city and port of Alexandroupolis, one of the new bases, where more than 6,000 US troops have landed and are moving with their heavy military equipment towards Germany, Latvia, Poland, and Romania under the Operation Defender 2021. With the helpful support and cooperation of its governments, Greece is becoming more than ever before a huge military base willing to take part in the imperialist plans in the region. it is clear for us that the engagement of countries in NATO or even in the European Union does not serve the peace and stability, neither the welfare of the peoples. Being part of imperialist alliances makes countries accomplices in crimes against humanity and turns them into potential targets for retaliation. It is dangerous rather than an illusion to believe that NATO or the EU will protect or safeguard sovereign rights of its members. The governments of these alliances are seeking for greater role in their regions under the imperialist umbrellas for bigger share of the looting of natural and energy resources. The engagement and commitment of all NATO states is clearly proved by the decisions of its summits. All NATO members have agreed on the military encirclement of Russia and the nuclear first strike options in previous summits. The deployment of military bases in the respective countries of Europe is taking place with the full endorsement of the governments, not necessarily of their people's will, of course. In the recent NATO summit, where the agenda NATO 2030 was approved, it has been explicitly mentioned that Russia and China have to be targeted as enemies of priority. Therefore, NATO demands the increase of the military expenditure to the 2% of their GDP per year in order to increase armaments. By the way, my country, Greece, which is a crisis-driven country with its people getting impoverished, is one of the few which is fulfilling already this 2% target. Dear friends and comrades, the tasks of the peace-loving forces and of the peace movement in our region, Europe, are demanding a clear opposition to the plans and policies of the European Union and a clear understanding of the nature of it. The recent years, the European Union has developed its common security and defense policy, the upgrading of the EU battle groups, the creation of the European Defense Fund, the strengthening of PESCO, Permanent Structural Cooperation, as well as the European Interventions Initiative. This European Union war machine will be coordinated with the NATO machinery that provides for creating 30 strong infantry units, 30 Air Force, and 30 naval ones that will be operable within 30 days. It's the magic 430s, whenever and wherever required for the benefit of American and European monopolies in competition with China and Russia. We cannot pick out some of the crimes of NATO or the EU and neglect others. What the imperialists are applying in Syria or Libya is related and in one line with what they do in Afghanistan. The imperialist interventions and sanctions against Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are of the same strategy with what they do against the DPR of Korea. The toleration of the occupation in Cyprus, in Palestine, and in Western Sahara is an expression of the hypocrisy and complicity with the occupying forces. The creation, funding, and training of extremist mercenary forces in the Middle East with the ISIS, as it has happened before with the Taliban in Afghanistan, shows openly the real face of the imperialists of US, NATO, and European Union. It is not expected that this will change now with the new US administration of Joe Biden, which only 36 days after taking office has launched a murderous airstrike against Syria with dozens of civilian casualties. There is no space for false hopes and expectations, false expectations in the peace movement. Dear comrades and friends, these challenging times of the last 1 year with the COVID-19 pandemic have multiple consequences for all of us. The enemies of peace have never stopped their plans in all corners of the planet. They even take advantage of the fear of the people and the restrictions we all have in our movements and actions. Nevertheless, we have never stopped being vigilant and on alert. Actions and meetings are taking place within the given conditions. We are hopeful that very soon the situation will improve, that the vaccines will reach the peoples in need, despite and against the policies of the powerful countries, despite and against the war of the vaccines and the enterprises who apply commercial criteria, neglecting the life of the vast majority of humanity. Warm, militant greetings to all of you and to the millions of people who fight for a world of peace and social justice against imperialist wars and exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Iraklis. I would like to introduce now Dr. Akel Tags, President of Palestinian Peace and Solidarity Committee. also a regional coordinator of the World Peace Council for the Middle East. Akel.
Thank you, Comrade Bahman. I would like also to salute, to say good evening or good morning for our comrades in the corners of this continent. Talking about Middle East, as you know, it is in the last decades a theater of interventions and military presence and bases from many sides from imperialist forces. And this is because this region is very rich with resources. First, it was oil and other metals. Now it is the gas in the East Mediterranean, and because of that, this efforts from imperialist forces to control the area is taking place last year's very intensive rhythm. Middle East also is very important for geopolitical reasons, and because it is between Europe, Asia, Africa, and because of that also forces who are controlling the area, controlling also the seas and the pipelines and the passage of ships. And because of that, there is from the beginning of the last century by imperialist forces in the end of the First World War, they with Sykes-Picot Agreement, they divided Middle East between the winners. Then Britain and France played the biggest role. And the most and the biggest in our evaluation, the biggest base in the Middle East started from the mid of 20s is Israel, created by the Western and imperialist countries to be the front base of these powers in the Middle East. After the end of the Second World War, and the United States to take the leading role of imperialist countries, many wars started in the Middle East, and they created a lot of military bases in the region. As you know, first it was the region of the Gulf, and because of that, all these countries had their bases, starting from England to have bases in United Arab Emirates, in Oman, in Kuwait, in many other countries. I will read where every country of these have these countries, imperialist countries, have their bases. But after the invasion of Iraq, 2003, U.S. and coalition bases in Iraq are tens of them. After that, France also started to have the bases in United Arab Emirates, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Kuwait, in Libya, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, also around in Djibouti and Eritrea. In Yemen, there is several military bases. Turkey also started to have its own intervention and bases. They have in Iraq, in Libya, also in Cyprus, and in Qatar, as you know, in Qatar. In Syria, they have also in United Kingdom has in Bahrain, in Iraq, in Qatar, in Oman, in United Arab Emirates, and then United States have the most military bases in the region. They have in Iraq, in Jordan, in Israel, in Kuwait, in Oman, in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, in Syria, in Tunisia. And because of that, we believe that the region of the Middle East is full of these bases, and not only bases. The US and French presence in Syria, for example, in Iraq, is a direct threat of war. And taking in consideration that it is not only this last 4 or 5 years with Donald Trump as President of the United States, we believe that this policy started in the era of Obama. He was the first to send the forces to Syria, for example, and to threat to attack Syria. The situation in the region is very, very complicated and dangerous. And after now, with the latest attacks of US forces in Syria against some Syrian or Iraqi forces inside Syria, and the behavior of American power in Iraq by killing some Iranian and Iraqi officers make the situation very, very dangerous. And because of that, we believe that nothing can be changed with Biden's administration. In contrary, we have some, we are the situation is in danger to continue the US presence in Syria. In Palestine, as you know, it is a direct occupation of Israeli army, which is the hugest base of imperialist power in the region. And without ending the occupation of Palestine, without withdrawal of imperialist forces from Syria and from Iraq, without ending the war in Yemen, we believe that Middle East will be in the center of the danger of new wars. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Akel. And now I would like to introduce Bimal Ratnakyake, President of Peace and Solidarity Organization of Sri Lanka, PASOS, and a member of Sri Lanka Parliament, actually. Comrade Bimal.
Yes, good afternoon, all comrades. And dear comrades, first of all, on behalf of Peace and Solidarity Organization of Sri Lanka, PASOS, I would like to thank for inviting me to represent Asia and Pacific region in this important webinar. So please accept our sincere appreciation to the World Peace Council and the organizers of this activity. Foreign military bases are open and direct extensions of imperialist policy. Traditional imperialist powers, as well as emerging regional big economic powers, are busy with establishing military bases, making military alliances, and signing military agreements. Due to the emergence of China and India as global economic powers, major share of the world trade has been shifted to Indian Ocean, bypassing the volume of trade exchange via Atlantic Ocean. Due to that economic and political importance of Asia in general, and particularly of Indian Ocean, big powers are fighting to secure maritime routes, to secure energy resources, to secure labor supply chains, to secure raw material supply chains, and to secure markets. Global powers and regional powers are crazily running here and there in the Indian Ocean and in generally Asia and Pacific regions. For an example, comrades, United States renamed their 70-year-old name of the Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command in 30th May 2018, giving prominence to this scenario. They changed the name, Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command. And in 2008, Obama administration introduced United States' new military political strategy called Pivot to Asia. Now I will speak about the foreign military bases in Asia Pacific region. Presence of US military bases. In Asia Pacific region, Japan has 11 bases, South Korea 15, Singapore 1, Australia 4, New Zealand 2, Uzbekistan 1, Kyrgyzstan 1, Philippines 5, and Guam many, and Afghanistan almost occupied territory with 8 main bases plus 5,500 US soldiers, and Diego Garcia is an island, an occupied militarized island by the US Army. So United States of America has around 50 bases plus hundreds of military facilities, and 120,000 US soldiers are in Asia Pacific region. But not only these US and NATO bases in our region, I think we have to mention about the real picture of other emerging big economic powers. Chinese military bases and military facilities in foreign countries also. One, Djibouti they have. In Myanmar, there's a small island called Great Coco Island. They have a base there. And Tajikistan. It says that even in Argentina, in Patagonia region, there is some level of Chinese base. And Indian military bases and Indian military facilities in foreign countries, especially in South Asia. Tajikistan, Farkhor Air Base, India has their air force there. Bhutan, there is an Indian training and military facility. Madagascar, Mauritius, Seychelles, all these 3 Indian Ocean islands, mainly Indian Navy has many facilities there. And Oman, in Nepal, there is an airstrip to Indian Air Force, and Maldives, mainly naval facilities. And then Pakistan military bases and military facilities in foreign countries. Pakistan also has a military base in Saudi Arabia since 1982. And 7th, the Australian military bases and military facilities in Asia Pacific region, mainly in Malaysia. There's a infantry training facility for Australian forces and United Arab Emirates. So those are the details of the foreign military bases in Asia and Pacific region. And then I'll come to military coalitions in Asia Pacific. First one is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It has 8 members headquartered in Beijing, established in 2004. This includes China, Russia, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and many 8 countries. And there are 6 observer states, including Nepal and Sri Lanka. And there's another newly emerging military coalition we call QUAD, QUAD, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. It calls Asian NATO. The members are India, USA, Japan, Australia. QUAD has done 25 naval exercises in Indian Ocean, and during last few years, it has become very active. This military alliance is to mainly target China. Now it has trying to bring Indonesia under QUAD due to Indonesia's largeness and vast territorial sea area. Then I will move to military agreements complex. Military agreements have become most effective and sophisticated military political instruments, which have been heavily used by the USA and other imperialist and economic powers. USA has signed AXA, Acquisition and Cross-Servicing Agreements, with 38 countries of Asia Pacific region. Sri Lanka, Maldives, and many countries have signed further strong military agreements with USA called SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement. And there are 5 main military agreements with USA with India. 2002, there is one agreement with India, and from 2016, India signed LSA agreement. 2016 again, Lemova agreement. 2018, COMCASA agreement, and 2020, BECA, Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, Actually, this was signed last 3 weeks of Trump administration during the visit of outgoing State Secretary Mike Pompeo. Here you can observe all 4 major agreements have been signed during last 4 years. And 10, the military agreements of India also. India signed a fresh military agreement with Maldives just a week ago, to 22nd of February this year, just a week ago, in the name of harbor protection. So likewise, Australia, China, Japan also have been making many military agreements with small and weaker nations. Finally, comrades, what we are experiencing nowadays. During the pandemic, last year, Chinese defense chief visited Sri Lanka. Indian foreign minister visited 2 times to Sri Lanka. Indian national security advisor visited Sri Lanka. But the irony is, no health minister or high-ranking health official ever visited Sri Lanka during this worst year of the pandemic. USA, China, and India madly engage in military-related activities. South China Sea issue also has been triggered this situation. A lot of governments in the region are allowing big powers to intervene in their countries due to debt trap, election financing, strategic assistance for ruling parties got during the elections, role of the corrupt and double agent diplomats, and huge penetration of various quarters of our societies by big powers using their huge resources. Grooming and financing to political parties, politicians, religious leaders, journalists, academia, NGOs are both influenced by these big powers. Through strong agitations in Sri Lanka, we were able to cancel the upgrading of SOFA agreement and signing of MCC agreement with USA. In summary, in Asia Pacific region, militarization is in the full swing. Mainly through military agreements are mushrooming. Military coalitions have been very active. Military bases and facilities are in the making. To protect the peace and stability in Asia Pacific, these militarization efforts should be exposed and defeated through people's struggles. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Comrade Wimmer. Our next speaker is supposed to be Margaret Kimberly, but she is joining us after 12 as she has another webinar to participate in until 12. So what I'm going to do is break the order and ask my comrade Roger Harris, a member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. Peace Council and a member of the Board of Task Force on the Americas, to take the floor.
Thank you, Bahman. And thank you, everybody, for coming to this very important webinar. It's really an honor to participate in this webinar with so many organizations and people who have been champions of world peace. And may I add, to be a champion of world peace, you also have to be a champion of opposition to the sole imperial superpower in the world today, which is the United States. Which brings me to the topic of my presentation and our new president, Joseph Biden, who made a major foreign policy priority speech at the Munich Security Conference just this February 19th. And Biden bellicosely proclaimed, "America is back." Repeated twice for effect, Biden signaled the end of the Trump interregnum. No more assuring words could have been uttered to the 70-odd Republican national security officials who had written a note, an open letter endorsing Biden for president out of fear that Trump would upset the bipartisan foreign policy consensus of the U.S. And that consensus consists of 3 legs: regime change, forever wars, and the NATO alliance. Republican neocons now shelter in the Democrats' big tent, today's party of war. The major difference between his predecessor and the new US president promises to be a greater reliance on multilateral diplomacy and international cooperative agreements to achieve US imperial goals. Biden pledged to remain in the World Health Organization, to return to the Paris Climate Agreement, although in reference to the climate agreement, the agreement is voluntary, and Biden defends fracking. After Trump withdrew the U.S. from the UN Human Rights Council 3 years ago, the U.S. will engage as an observer in the Human Rights Council. And Trump's Muslim ban was reversed in Biden's first day in office. Regardless of the changing of guard in Washington, the imperial goal of full spectrum dominance endures. From one administration to the next, the global network of foreign military bases will not be shuttered. The fact that the U.S. can, with impunity, punish a third of humanity, that's 39 nations, with illegal sanctions, what the UN calls unilateral coercive measures, is a measure of its hegemonic standing. These sanctions are a form of hybrid warfare, which can be just as deadly as outright war. Although Biden is reviewing the sanctions policy in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, he is expected to keep using the U.S. sanctions weapon, just with a sharper aim. The new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, asserted that his policies will follow his predecessor, but will more effectively target official enemies such as Venezuela, and will double down on Russia. Biden warned in his foreign policy priorities speech about, quote, competition among countries that threaten to divide the world caused by shifting global dynamics. The threat of, quote, divide the world, unquote, that concerns the U.S. president is precisely any deviation from U.S. dominance. Biden was referring to the emergence, of course, of rival imperial powers. His warnings affirms and extends Trump's 2017 national security strategy doctrine of great power competition, and swings away from Obama's earlier and subsequently abandoned concept of international interdependence. Biden's shifting global dynamics, what Obama's defense secretary Chuck Hagel referred to as, quote, challenging the world order that American leadership helped build after World War II. In other words, the world's sole superpower is adverse to an emerging multipolar world. Biden's speech concluded, quote, we are at an inflection point caused by new crises. While not explicitly identified by Biden, this implicit recognition is a recognition of an impending crisis of legitimacy of the neoliberal world order. The U.S. is the main beneficiary, proponent, and enforcer of a global political economy that increasingly is seen as failing to meet people's needs. Class disparities during an economic recession exacerbated by the COVID pandemic are ever more evident in the United States and internationally. While still president, Trump spoke against the U.S. as the world's cop, and I quote Trump directly. The plan is to get out of endless wars, to bring our soldiers back home, to be policing not to be policing agents all over the world, end quote. Now, for a variety of reasons, Trump's iconoclastic words never found their way into policy, and certainly Biden's speechwriters will never give him similar words to read. Rather, Biden said in his foreign policy speech that the U.S. is, quote, fully committed to our NATO alliance and welcomes Europe's growing investment in military capabilities. The U.S. mission in Iraq will be expanded and more troops are being sent to Germany. Biden justifies the NATO military encirclement of Russia with intimations that Ukraine and Georgia may eventually join by, quote, the threat from Russia, unquote. However, Russian reactions to the staging of hostile war games and nuclear-capable facilities on its borders are plausibly defensive. Meanwhile, the U.S.-led military alliance has long since broken loose from its Atlantic-centric borders, with NATO's partners across the globe extending to Afghanistan, Australia, Colombia, Iraq, Japan, Republic of Korea, Mongolia, New Zealand, and Pakistan. The new administration will expand U.S. military presence in Africa through its African Command, known as AFRICOM. Trump extended the U.S.'s, quote, special relationship, unquote, in the Middle East with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Biden continues that trajectory. Trump's provocative move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem will not be reversed by Biden, nor will Palestinian rights be recognized. After China and Russia, Iran ranks in the U.S.'s official enemies list. Ignoring nuclear-armed Israel, the Biden team continues the U.S.'s obsession with Iran's nuclear program. Although Biden has committed to renegotiate a better deal regarding Iran after Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, the to-be-negotiated deal includes Trump's demand to include Iran's entire regional policy. One of Biden's first major foreign policy initiatives was just 3 days ago with the bombing of Syria, and he has pledged to increase U.S. troops in Syria as well. The treatment of Latin America and the Caribbean as the U.S.'s proprietary backyard. Just 1 second, please. The treatment of Latin America and Caribbean as U.S.'s proprietary backyard after the dates back to the 1823 Monroe Doctrine is being challenged by a rising pink tide, especially the continued resistance of Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and now rejoined by Bolivia. Biden has not restored Obama's openings to Cuba, which were reversed by Trump, and he has already deported thousands of immigrants back to Haiti and other countries. Following Obama's pivot to Asia in 2012, Biden's policy portends continuing Trump's hostility toward China, only with further intensification. The containment of China is now the prime focus of the U.S. empire. Also in Asia, the U.S. administration will be augmenting troops in Afghanistan. The U.S. is ringing Russia and China with missile defense systems. These had previously been illegal until George W. Bush abrogated the U.S.-Russia Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. Ominously, the head of the U.S. Strategic Air Command warned just this month that a conflict with Russia or China, quote, nuclear deployment is a very real possibility, end quote. Given this international climate, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists set the 2021 doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight. Now that's the end of my presentation, but what I've told you is just half the story. The other half of the story is resistance of the peoples of the world to U.S. imperialism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger. Our speaker on Africa is still not here. She texted me that she's still on the other event and she will join us as soon as it ends. So I'm going to ask Ambassador Zelmys Maria to start speaking, and after that, we'll have hopefully our Africa speaker by the time. Ambassador, please.
Yes, comrades, on behalf of the Cuban Movement for Peace and Sovereignty of the Peoples, we thank the World Peace Council and the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Military Bases for the invitation to take part in this online conference to mark February 23rd, the International Day of Action Against U.S. NATO Military Bases, declared at the first International Conference Against U.S. NATO Military Bases held in Dublin, Ireland in November of 2018. Military bases, or enclaves, the term currently used, are a permanent threat to world peace and to sovereignty and the self-determination of peoples. They are used to launch harassment and military aggression against governments that do not yield to the demands of the U.S. government. For Cuba, this date has an historical significance. It marks 118 years of the illegal occupation of the Guantanamo Naval Base, the oldest military enclave of the United States beyond its frontiers, and the only one that exists against the will of the country where it is located and of its people. The naval station in Guantanamo Bay was established in 1898 when the United States militarily occupied the island following the defeat of Spain in the Spanish-American War. The agreement for the lease of coal and naval stations between the government of the United States and the government of Cuba was signed on February 23, 1903, at a time when the island had virtually no independence due to the imposition of the Platt Amendment passed by the U.S. Congress. Since the triumph of the revolution in 1959, Cuba has not accepted the imposition of this treaty and has demanded the return of the illegally occupied territory in all multilateral forums because it has been continuously used for threats, provocations, and violations of our sovereignty. The presence of this base hinders local socioeconomic development since it prevents the adequate use of the area's natural resources and the study of adjacent land and marine ecosystems. Additionally, buildings in the military zone prevent the Guantanamo and Guaso River basins from draining properly. After September 11, 2001, this naval base was turned into a prison for alleged terrorists. The United States has illegally used it as a concentration camp, prison, and site of torture, humiliation, and discrimination. These actions violate the most elementary rights of the human species, the right to life and human dignity, as well as civil and political rights. Here, in the 21st century, prisoners do not have access to justice and are arbitrarily sentenced without trial to unlimited prison terms and inconceivable torture, abusing the modern doctrine of criminal law of the enemy. They do not respect international humanitarian law, Convention 3, that protects prisoners of war. Logically, the empire refuses to recognize them as prisoners of war to prevent them from receiving the rights enshrined in the convention and instead illegally calls them illegal combatants, a term that is not recognized by international humanitarian law. For that reason, until the occupied territory is returned to Cuba, the Cuban Movement for Peace and Sovereignty of Peoples, together with the World Peace Council and other organizations, will continue organizing the International Seminar for Peace and the Abolition of Foreign Military Bases every 2 years in the province of Guantanamo. This has become a forum for the world to denounce and condemn imperialism. Comrades, in these difficult times, when humankind has been waging a constant fight against the consequences of COVID-19, U.S. imperialism has not ceased its attacks, consequently hindering the control and containment of the pandemic. The U.S. considers Latin America and the Caribbean to be its backyard. That is why we reiterate the need to fulfill the postulates of the Proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace, approved at the second summit of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, in Havana in January of 2014. Cuba will not cease in its struggle for the return of the territory occupied by the Guantanamo Naval Base, nor will it cease to demand the lifting of the criminal, economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed upon our country more than 60 years ago, which hinders the economic and social development of our people. We implore you to continue to resist the expansion of military bases across the planet, from which the empire launches its aggression and actively threatens the peoples of the world. There is no better way to end this conference than to recall the words of Commander Fidel Castro on July 26, 1962, and I quote, "The U.S. naval base in Guantanamo Bay is a dagger plunged into the heart of Cuban soil. We will not take the base away from them by force, but we will never renounce our right to that piece of land." Close quote. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zelmys. Unfortunately, the program that our Africa speaker is on is still going on, and she promised to be here at 12:30. So why don't we start, with apologies, of course, start our Q&A session, and then we can have her speak whenever she joins us. Margaret Flowers will be moderating this for us, and I will turn it over to Margaret. Thank you very much, Margaret.
Thank you, Bahman, and thank you to all of our speakers. I'm actually going to make each of you pinned so we can have each of you in the, let's see, oh, I'll have to change that. Anyway, I'll fix that. But the first question actually goes to Carolus Wimmer, and it's, let me read the question. And if you want to ask a question, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A icon, and you can type your question there. So this one reads, Carolus Wimmer mentioned that there are 3 U.S. military bases in Mexico. However, the official position and information in Mexico is that we don't allow military intervention in any way. Where are these bases located? How is it possible that the public in my country are not informed? And what can we do about this situation? Carolus? And I've asked you to unmute so we can hear you.
Ok, respondo en el español para acompañar nuestra embajadora, Domínguez.
Okay, well, I'll respond in Spanish in recognition of Ambassador Zelmys. Yes, it's true that with the current government in Mexico, their position is that direct intervention of the United States has been difficult. Presently, there are agreements between the state governments, the governments of these states, that continue active. It's also important, generally, not just in Mexico, but generally, it's important to know that right now the definition of what a military base is has changed, taking into account new technologies. We know that for drone warfare, we don't need to see large military bases. Rather, drone warfare is something that can be managed from an office. So it's very important that from the movement for peace, for the struggle for peace, we stay vigilant and watch these changes, that we stay vigilant of the United States and other imperialist countries that we have near here in Venezuela. For example, Dutch bases, French bases, both of which we see in the very coast of Venezuela. These are also sites that are currently not active. So there's not a lot of personnel, nor is there a lot of presence of arms or equipment for war, but there are also bases, as we see in Curaçao and Aruba, from one minute to another, these bases can be transformed into a base of attacks, where aggression can be initiated or supported, direct aggressions. We talk a lot about the United States, that is currently the principal aggressor, but there are also NATO allies present in our region. And that's why it's important to mention what's been mentioned about Mexico. We see a new politic with this new government and this current new president, current government that favors the sovereignty of Mexico. But we also know the long history of dependence on and intervention by the United States. Naturally, then we still have the possibility of, with sectors of the armed forces are not necessarily unlinked from the imperialist project of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next question is really more of a comment, but it says, I have been reading up on long-range cannons that U.S. Army has proposed in the next 2 years with 1,000-mile strike range. Placed on warships, they would be able to bypass permission from U.S. allies that would be adverse to having these weapons on their soil. Now the conversation also turns to newer warships. Billions of dollars, and perhaps this exercise investment may not prove feasible, but it certainly adds more stress to the goal of disarmament. Does anybody have a comment on these new weapons bypassing permission from allies to be deployed? You can unmute yourself if you'd like to respond. Or signal? No? Okay. Let's go to the next one then.
No, Margaret.
Yes, go ahead, Iraklis.
Maybe I can add 2 elements in a way related to the question. If we follow the global figures on military spending in the world, last year I think the Stockholm Institute for Peace and Research wrote down $1.8 trillion, amongst which 750 billion is spent only by one country, which is the US. If we take this growing figures for all these years, although the economies are in crisis and recession, and the last year in particular becomes more provocative when the health pandemic with 2.5 million dead people and hundreds of millions of infected, and people in poverty and extreme poverty, even more now with the pandemic. How much, what little money, what part of all this money of 1.8 trillion, if 10%, even less of this money would be spent, not only for the pandemic, but for vaccines for all, for people in need, but for curable diseases in Africa and in the world, many problems of humanity would have been solved. Instead of this, the major weapons producers, and this is of course the reason they exist, are handling, treating the governments as good clients, and they are serving the enterprises, and therefore they are in power in order to sell and buy more and more weapons to carry out more and more aggressions and wars in the world. And this is a vicious circle, and this can not be dealt only by praying for peace or wishing for peace. It needs the active engagement of grassroots movements, of peace movements, of popular movements, peoples who resist these policies where the industrial military complex of major forces in the US, in Germany, in Britain, in France, the ones who are producing, are increasing their profits, and this becomes, I repeat, even more provocative in days of the pandemic, where one small part of these amounts could solve people's problems.
Thank you. And here's a question again for Carlos. I'll translate from Spanish. It says, do you know if in Costa Rica there exist military bases with new names and new forms? We know that Costa Rica and the United States have relations that are not only diplomatic, but also military, supposedly to attack the narco trafficking. For example, there exists a radar on the island of Coco, but the people aren't aware of these relations. Can you comment on that, Carlos? Oh, let me ask you to unmute. Can you unmute, Carlos?
Sorry.
There you go.
Sí, eso especialmente en América.
Yeah, especially in Latin America, but also right now throughout the world. As I mentioned earlier, even in Venezuela, before the government of President Hugo Chavez, there was a strong military presence of the US military. There wasn't officially a military base, but as President Chavez himself denounced in the defense ministry of Venezuela, there was a Pentagon office that was previously unknown, but came to be known after the political rupture with the United States and the government, and the installation of a government that actually protects the sovereignty of Venezuela. And it's true that in Costa Rica, as in other Central American countries, and also Brazil, there is the radar station, and we could also include this under the definition of buildings or spaces, equipment that can be used in certain times in moments of war or imperialist aggression against the very population or against other countries. So against the population in that country or other countries. And so that's why we see that there is a need to develop technology, not just within the territory, but also, well, now we see bases in Latin America that are dedicated to espionage and cyber warfare. We see that we see the presence, we see that the traditional definition of military bases, what we might imagine when we have, big military installations with airports and planes and tanks and soldiers, that's changing in many places. And so that's why military presence is even more intense while it is invisible, especially within the framework of cyber warfare and the ability to intervene in a country's communication system. And that's why the struggle against empire means, as we say, we seek not just that they abandon imperialist military bases, but also we need to include the subject of anything that could influence or complicate or attack the sovereignty of a country. Things like, for example, telecommunications. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. The next one I think anybody can respond to is, how can we remain vigilant of smaller bases like those used for drones, which countries may not classify as an official base, which we know can be rapidly expanded? Anybody have thoughts on how to be aware of these smaller bases? Okay. The next one is, has there been any criticism of Biden's bombing of Syria by the European government, especially Germany?
Margaret?
Yes.
Yes. I think that we have to state without any surprise that nobody in the European Union, not a single government of the member state has objected or and very much less denounced this airstrike of the US under the new US administration, which is actually a continuation of the same strategy. And it would be a surprise if they would have done so. And this is, as I said also in my introduction, they are hand in hand. They may differ in their priorities, or they even have antagonistic interests in who will take a bigger share or control of the sphere of influence of this or that sphere of influence, but they would never denounce and condemn each other when it comes to countries under attack, and in particular in Syria. The European Union, as also mentioned by other speakers, and also it is said also by Carolus about the recent famous Munich Security Conference, they are in one line. So I would be really very surprised if they would denounce this. And I don't know from where the question comes from in regards to Germany. Why should Germany in particular object this airstrike of the US? You see, sometimes when we speak about foreign military bases, and I mentioned Ramstein in Germany, there are forces in the global peace movement, and in particular also in Germany, which speak about the need to close down the Ramstein bases, which is legitimate, correct, and just demand, which we share. But it would be only the half truth if we would not mention that Ramstein, like many other bases in Europe, like the ones I forgot to mention, like the Rota base in Spain, or like the NATO facilities in Italy, the Naples strategic headquarters of NATO, are there with the full endorsement and agreement of the host, so to say, countries. This means Ramstein is not there as an occupation force, as an occupation facility, like it is the case of Cuba, Guantanamo. That's why we stressed that Guantanamo and Cuba is the only case where people and government for more than 60 years are demanding the closure of and return of this territory. Germany and Ramstein, for example, as a particular example, is not that type. The people of Germany, we can't estimate what is really the percentage and the will of the German people, but that is irrelevant, because in this point, the German government is fully in line and is welcoming the US facilities at Ramstein bases, and they would never, and they are facilitating many of the attacks in the Middle East are going through Shannon, through Ramstein, through the military bases in Greece, in Turkey, and the naval forces in the Mediterranean Sea.
Thank you, Iraklis. So then the next question is, there's quite a few questions of the same manner, and I'm hoping that each of you will respond to this. And I know that Margaret should be joining us soon, so we may have to break off and allow her to speak and then return to this question. But the question is, how do the panelists assess the current state of the peace movement regionally and internationally? And what concrete steps are needed to revitalize the mass struggle for peace, disarmament, and resistance to imperialist aggression and war? So the state of the peace movement and what we can do to revive it. Who would like to go first? Roger?
Yeah, so let me just kick that off because it's really the key question. And let me start by saying that there is a basis for it. And there's a group called Vox Populi, and they did some polls of the American public. And they found out, let me read this. They found that majorities or pluralities of the US people support 1, reducing the military budget, 2, achieving peace by avoiding foreign intervention, negotiating directly with adversaries to avoid military confrontation, decreasing US troops overseas, and constraining the president's ability to attack a foreign adversary. So there is a basis in the American public for a vibrant peace movement. And the task is really to unite people around that. And there are grassroots efforts. The US Peace Council is involved in an effort called Move the Money from Military to Human Needs. And so there is a growing movement. There's also a situation in the United States where in the last election, there was a great deal of sort of insurrectionary feeling within the people. I think a lot of the Trump vote was a vote not so much for Trump, but against the current order. And a lot of the vote for Biden was kind of hoping for another change. But what happened was that a lot of that effort got into the electoral process. And that's not bad. The peace movement needs to be engaged in the electoral process. We need to lobby Congress, and we need to have the Congress people listen to us. But the basis for that, of course, is a strong movement which will force them to listen to us. So there is a basis, and I think I'll let the other panelists speak to the issue as well.
Thank you. What I'd like to do at this point is to turn it back over to Bahman to introduce Margaret, and then we'll return to this question, and I hope that everyone can get a chance to respond to that.
Well, thank you both Margarets, and Margaret Flowers for letting me speak, and Margaret Kimberly for making it finally. It must have been a very important event that maybe you were hosting it or something. But I would like to introduce Margaret Kimberly. Margaret is a member of the coordinating committee of Black Alliance for Peace, and also a senior columnist for Black Agenda Report, and she's also on the coordinating committee of the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Military Bases. Margaret, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bahman, and thank you all for your patience. It's not the way I usually like to do things, but anyway, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and it's an honor to be with friends and comrades who gathered in Dublin a few years ago for that first international conference. I was there. I took part in a panel on U.S. NATO bases in Africa, and we discussed the impact of AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command, which came into being in 2008 at the end of the George W. Bush administration. And this is interesting. This was the official statement made at that time, quote, AFRICOM will strengthen our security cooperation with Africa and create new opportunities to bolster the capabilities of our partners in Africa. Africa Command will enhance our efforts to bring peace and security to the people of Africa and promote our common goals of development, health, education, democracy, and economic growth, unquote. Of course, none of that is true, and that's why I read it to point out that it is not. But the US has divided up the world into various commands. There's a CENTCOM, a EUCOM, an Indo-PACOM, NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, et cetera. I don't know how many people know that the US took it upon itself to do that. But AFRICOM, while founded in the waning days of Bush 43, came to full fruition during Obama's administration. And this 21st century scramble for Africa, is a result of several events, all of which can be blamed on the US. AFRICOM is the sad contribution to the perpetual war of American terror, which accelerated after September 11, 2001. Of course, AFRICOM is problematic for many reasons. It makes the US the de facto head of African militaries, more than 30 to date. And it also, and that's another point of it, is to minimize the influence of any other country, China in particular, which is the country most connected to African nations economically. Fighting terror is a catch-all phrase which explains away US efforts at hegemony, and it's US terrorism in places like Somalia, where there are still, yes, under Biden, drone strikes happening to this very day. AFRICOM was unknown to most people until 2017, when 4 troops were killed in Niger. And until that time, most people in this country had never heard of AFRICOM or even of Niger, or were afraid to say it because it sounded like a slur. It was this mysterious place. But the news story took on a life of its own because of Trump, because he insulted one of the families, and the opportunity to talk about AFRICOM was lost very conveniently. And it's important to note, there were some members of Congress, including some senators, who claimed they didn't know there were US troops in Niger. And I think they may actually be telling the truth about that. So at that time, it became known to the public that there was a US Africa command. According to a recent press report, AFRICOM acknowledges that there are between 5,200 and 5,700 US troops in Africa at any one time at a variety of bases and other facilities. There's one large base in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier, and there are smaller facilities. Some are just drone bases all over the continent, but generally these are not acknowledged. I want to talk about the work of Black Alliance for Peace and give you just a little background about us. Started in 2017, founded on April 1st, a very significant date, the assassination date of Dr. King in '68, and a year to the day that he publicly opposed the war in Vietnam, and in effect opposed Lyndon Johnson, a great political act, probably one of the greatest acts of his life. And at Black Alliance for Peace, we are devoted to ending, of course, as a member of the Coalition Against Foreign Military Bases, but we have a campaign to get the US out of Africa. And we have a petition. You can still sign it, tinyurl.com/shutdownAFRICOM. And the goal of this petition is to advocate with legislators, with members of Congress. We are asking specifically for the Congressional Black Caucus to take the lead in holding hearings, and we're not naive about this. Obviously, we want the issue of foreign military bases that intervene in other countries, which diminish the sovereign rights of people and governments around the world, and also take away from the American people. But by holding public hearings, the public will not forget about the US being in Africa, and members of Congress won't forget. This these bases impact our lives in a very direct way. We have a military budget that's huge, $740 billion. And it's literally why Americans can't have nice things, can't have the things we need, be it infrastructure, education, healthcare. It's 60% of the discretionary budget in the US goes to the military, which of course goes into supporting these bases all over the world, which do environmental damage. The Defense Department is the biggest polluter in the world. Obviously, you can't have aircraft carriers and bases all over the world and not do damage to the environment, to do damage to people. And I hope you take the opportunity to go to our website, blackallianceforpeace.com, and see our campaigns, one of which is to end the 1033 program, which is another way that military involvement around the world impacts people here directly. 1033 program gives surplus military equipment to local police departments in big cities and small towns alike, have armored vehicles and all manner of equipment that one would expect to see overseas. But that is the problem with militarization. You're not going to have a country that militarizes abroad and does not do that at home. So that communities, especially communities of color, are occupied just as foreign countries are occupied by these military bases. And I want to talk, I know it's not Africa, I want to talk briefly about Haiti. We have a Black Alliance for Peace. We have a campaign, US Out of Haiti. On Monday, this March 1st at 10 a.m., there's going to be a protest at the Haitian embassy in Washington, D.C. Haiti is treated like Africa is treated. It's a country that has paid a high price for its desire for independence. We have a puppet president, Jovenel Moïse, who was supposed to have left office on February 7th, but he is the US puppet and he is allowed to stay against the will of the Haitian people. It's something that doesn't get a lot of attention, but there have been huge protests in Haiti against not only that particular despot, but against the US and Canada and NATO, which have used the UN to occupy that country, to even bring cholera to that country. And this is the work of the Black Alliance for Peace to advocate on behalf of this Black-led nation, as well as the nations of Africa, which have suffered so much because of AFRICOM. Thank you very much. That's my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Margaret. And we had just started our Q&A before you joined us. And perhaps you'd like to respond to this question that we were just starting to have folks respond to. And it's about how do you assess the current state of the peace movement regionally and internationally, and what concrete steps are needed to revitalize mass struggle for peace, disarmament, and resistance to imperialist aggression and war. And specifically to you, Margaret, there was a question regarding Congo. You know, how can we raise up the struggle in Congo more and do something to stop the massacre that's happening there?
Yeah, Congo is, it's a lot going on there. I think the state of the peace movement needs to be stronger. I'll put it in a positive way. And I think we need to more and more give up dependence on electoral politics. I think here in the United States especially, we depend on electoral politics. We depend on somebody who is supposed to be a lesser evil, usually a Democrat, usually who is not a lesser evil. We know that Biden already bombed Syria last week. They have, it's interesting, declassified this report about Khashoggi's assassination, which means they're trying to intervene in Saudi Arabia and get a different government. But we have to rely less and less on electoral politics. We have to build strong left parties, which means not the Democrats. And I think we have to be We just have to be committed to speaking out against US imperialism. We must be uncompromising in opposing US imperialism. It is used in so many different ways, in some of the ways I've mentioned. It's used to tell us lies. We are, have been convinced, without proof, I might add, that there's a genocide going on in China, a ginned up story made to get people who are people of goodwill, who want to do the right thing. That's why they tell these stories about Saddam Hussein gassing people, or Gaddafi giving giving troops Viagra. Excuse me. It's to get buy-in. Sorry. It's to get buy-in, to get people to support things they otherwise would not. But we're less likely to fall for this if we are in opposition to US imperialism. And we must always do a lot of work. You can't depend on the corporate media to get information about any place in the world and think that you know the truth. That's why formations like this are so important. And it doesn't matter if someone's supposed to be the lesser evil, if Trump is supposed to be so awful, whatever it is, we are told we must oppose imperialism. We must oppose expansion of a US military presence, the responsibility to protect. That's another way they tell us that people are suffering somewhere, and unless America drops bombs and kills people, that they're going to suffer even more.
Thank you. And who would like to speak next to that question? Maybe Dr. Tax or Bimal or Ambassador. Do you have any thoughts on the current peace movement and what we can do? Remember to unmute yourself.
Can I add something for this question, please?
Please do.
The problem is that the peace movement in our region, in the Middle East, is suffering also as our people is suffering from occupation, from interventions, from bombing. And this policy of imperialist forces in the Middle East make the situation for peace movement and for peace-loving people or for fighters more difficult, because you can imagine to talk about peace with Palestinians who are under occupation, and in the prisons there is 4,000 or 5,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails. Israel is attacking villages and cities every day, arresting checkpoints, blockades, and to talk about peace and about the political solution of the Palestinian problem is very, very difficult. You can imagine how Israeli peace-loving people under attack of the extra right Israeli governments and supporters of Netanyahu or settlers, how can they talk about peace and solution with Palestinians? What can you say to the Iraqis or Syrian people who are refugees in Lebanon or in Turkey, or who are dying through the Mediterranean to escape from bombing from United States and allies, from Turkish invasion from ISIS? The situation is very difficult, and because of that, I believe that there is some differences between talking about peace fighters in the United States who are fighting for changing the policy of their country, or in Europe to express solidarity with the peoples who are under occupation. Or can you imagine how can anybody talk with Yemeni people about peace or about struggle for peace without ending this war by coalition supported by Western countries, by United States in the first place? And because of that, we believe that in general, peace-loving people and peace movement in other regions are expressing their solidarity with our people, also with our peace movement to be more strong and stronger, and to have conditions to achieve, to fight and to mobilize people for peace. It is very, very difficult, unfortunately.
Thank you. Would
Margaret,
anybody else like to respond, Yamal?
Margaret, may I make a comment?
Go ahead.
Regarding this role of peace movements, especially the region which I am representing, Asia Pacific is a huge region, but if I focus it into South Asia region where I come from, I can say that within almost all the countries in South Asia, there is a established some level of sentiments or feelings of anti-imperialism, especially anti-US. So this is a positive nature. I mean, for an example, we were in Sri Lanka, we were able to cancel the upgrading of status of forces agreement. When Mike Pompeo was visiting Sri Lanka, it was his intention to upgrade that agreement, but it was not possible to do because Sri Lanka government, even though government wanted to upgrade it, but because of the tremendous criticism and agitations against Mike Pompeo's visit and his intentions, government and the US, they were not able to upgrade it. And I do know, especially in Bangladesh and Nepal and even in India, there is a common anti-American, anti-US imperialist mindset is still there. But we cannot say it is mainly, this is a huge political asset. Actually, it was invested, it was a creation of the left movements and the working class movements of those countries for decades. But the problem we are observing is, when we talk about anti-imperialism, when we struggle about anti-imperialism, really we are facing a practical problem here. Normally, I mean, at the same time, we are observing the issues of the countries who should not. Okay, I will put it in a very simple way. I mean, especially in our country, the role of Chinese government, it has become a big issue here. Okay, we are fighting against the US imperialism, but at the same time, Sri Lanka has been getting to the debt trap. Okay, it's a main fault of our capitalist government, but people do know that the role of Chinese government is also not in favor of Sri Lankan people. So then there is a huge, then the capitalist media, they create this issue. They create this issue. I will conclude my comment saying this, because comrade, we held a huge demonstration in front of US Embassy in Sri Lanka when Mike Pompeo was visiting. So he was visiting 6 countries in our region. So what did capitalist press? They asked, just 1 month ago, there was a Chinese senior minister visited Sri Lanka. He was not the same level of Mike Pompeo, of course. So we didn't make a demonstration in front of Chinese embassy, of course, but so then the capitalist press asked, Chinese government has been buying a lot of Sri Lankan assets and we had to give our Sri Lankan news. So now they are making a lot of issues. So you oppose only US imperialism, but why don't you oppose your friendly, this kind of nations interferences? So this is a dilemma, this is an issue we are facing. Okay, we do know that Chinese interference or Chinese involvements are not same like US. You can't put them put two inners in the same basket. But within the general public, we are facing this issue. So I think the only way out is to make more progressive, more left, more socialist organizations, not only the parties actually. So that's what we have been trying to do. So this is the nature actually. We are not very much growing, but still we are having this anti-US feeling among the masses. So we are trying to capitalize it to oppose this militarization of Asia Pacific.
Thank you. And Ambassador, would you like to add anything to that question?
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, and thank you very much.
I think you may have frozen.
The sound froze, yes.
Ambassador, maybe if you try to turn off your video. Let's see if this brings you back. Okay. All right, while we sort out the ambassador's connection, the next question is directed to you, Iraklis, and the question begins with a comment. Canadian Foreign Minister Marc Garneau recently met with Secretary Anthony Blinken, where Garneau reaffirmed Canada's support and assigned role in US NATO foreign policy. Canada assumes that assigned role presently through Canada's interventionist and trade interference roles in the Lima Group in Central and South America, and through weapons supplies and training to the Ukraine. Canada has increased its military budget by 25% over the 2016 budget to align with the NATO 2014 Wales Summit. The question to Iraklis is, where does the World Peace Council see the most dangerous expressions of US NATO aggression manifesting in the next 1 to 2 years?
Yes, thank you, Margaret. And thanks to our Canadian friends for this expression of the information and the question. You see, it is really a risk to make an assessment of and categorization, a ranking of the hotspots of imperialism in the world. Normally, when we talk, when we exchange views in our meetings in the World Peace Council, we list always the Middle East as one of the biggest, if not the biggest hotspots. And that is related to the fact and to the nature of imperialism, which is not only wars, invasions, occupation, troops, military bases, but it has a very solid economic basis. And if the energy resources, the oil reserves, and the energy routes, the pipelines are around the Middle East, in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf and so on, it is understandable, let me say it in this way, without justifying nothing of the imperialist plans, that they are focusing on the Middle East. And we know it's not only Palestine. Without the solution of the Palestinian cause and the independent viable state, nothing will be solved in the Middle East, but it is also Syria, Iraq, it is Yemen with the dirty war of the Saudi-led coalition, fully supported by the US, the UK, and actually tolerated in complicity by all major forces in the European Union and of course by NATO. Even Greece, this small country I'm coming from, has sent Patriot missiles to Saudi Arabia because the US asked, if you are a good, reliable and predictable ally, like our Prime Minister said to Donald Trump last year, then you have to help. So every dirty job has to be shared by all the allies. So Middle East is for sure, how to say, an important hotspot, and it has to be dealt also by the peace movement and the World Peace Council as such. but we have to follow also the declarations and the texts of the imperialists. NATO, in its doctrine, in its Agenda 2030, this means the forecast for the next 10 years, they are openly saying that Russia and China are their enemies and opponents in priority. We know that from the previous US administration, with the pivot to Asia, shifting 60% of all military power of the US to the Asia Pacific, the introduction of the new term by the US, which is broadly used also and adopted by the mainstream media in the world, the Indo-Pacific, we know very well that exactly for the same reason that the basis for the analysis and assessments and the priorities of imperialism is the economy and the economic targets and profits of the enterprises the governments are serving, that since there is a huge competition on who is the first, who's the number one in economic terms worldwide, if it is the US or if China will overturn in the coming years, that China is targeted and is being surrounded by various provocations. The Tibet issue, the monks, the Falun Gong, the Hong Kong issue, or the intervention and interference in the Western province, autonomous province in China, with the Uyghurs minority, which in which not only the US but also Turkey and other forces have their fingers and their hands in, which does not mean, and let me put this clearly, that when we declare our solidarity and our condemnation to provocations against China wherever it takes place, like in the examples I mentioned before, this does not mean that we endorse or we can hail all the foreign policy of one or another state. Which, of course, I agree with Bimal, does not mean that we equate or we put in the same basket China's foreign policy or the fact that they have 1 or 2 foreign military bases in Djibouti or elsewhere with the 800 foreign military bases of the US. Of course, it is not a matter of quantity. It is a matter of political approach and of stand in the international arena. Let me give you another example, and sorry for taking more time. We support every country and state government if it takes principal positions in the UN. At the same time, when the same country takes ambiguous or problematic positions on other international issues, we as World Peace Council have a clear critical view and stand. And the example to that is, for example, Libya, when in 2014, the UN Security Council was discussing about the so-called imposition of the non-flying zone on Libya, which was the prelude actually for bombing and dismembering Libya, for the violent regime change and assassination of Colonel Gaddafi. China and Russia had a veto right as permanent Security Council members. They did never execute it. They voted abstention. This does not mean that China and Russia are criminals like NATO and the US and France is who bombed Libya, but they tolerated, and in this way, they did not put themselves on the side of the international law and of the peace. And this is what we criticize. So we are obliged to be truthful, and the good friends are supporting each other, but when they see problematic issues, and then they have to be critical and without, I repeat, equating things.
Thank you. And I'm glad to see that Ambassador Domínguez Cortina is back. Why don't you finish, and then we'll turn it back over to Bahman to end the program.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry, because we have problems with the connection during the whole conference. I only want to say that in Cuba it's easy because of the communion of interest between the peace movement, the Cuban peace movement, the people and the government. So for us, as a country, not only the peace movement, but the country, the people, and the government, we are against all these military bases, starting by Guantanamo that we explained before, but also we are for disarmament. And that's why we encourage a lot to fulfill what is stated in the declaration of Latin America as zone of peace that was made during the CELAC summit in Havana, because it's important to fight in all the international forums for the assurance of peace. And this is a very difficult task, because as all my colleagues explained, the situation in the whole world is very difficult. There are a lot of wars, compromises, problems, US military bases, NATO military bases, everything. So the importance of the peace movement, the resistance of the people, the unity, as some of the people in the chat said, that is very important to unite efforts and fight for a better world against all these military bases and for peace and disarmament. And this movement is a great example. And Cuba, thanks a lot for all the efforts that you are doing, supporting us, not only in Guantanamo, but also against the blockade. And some of the people in the chat mentioned against all these diseases and sabotage and problems that for 6 decades we have in Cuba due to the influence and the actions of the United States, because they don't want a country that want to be free and not under their mandate. So thank you again for letting us participate. I'm here on behalf of the president of the Cuban peace movement, because unfortunately, because of the blockade, we are not able to use Zoom in Cuba. That's why he's not here. And I'm here because I'm in Greece. So it's easy in Greece using Zoom, not in Cuba. Thank you very much, dear friends, for all your solidarity and support.
Well, it was a great program. I would like to thank everybody, all the speakers who took the time to inform us about the situation in various parts of the world, especially with regard to the military bases. I would like to thank the participants who spent time listening to all of us. And I would like to thank our two great interpreters, Jill and Jasmine, for the great job they did. I would like to close by saying that I endorse Margaret Kimberly's position that we have to move our peace movement more toward anti-imperialist orientation, less on relying on, especially in the West, relying on governments to make changes for us, and focusing more on grassroots movements to organize from below to force the governments to respect the people's will. And this is what is needed, really. And I think so long as such an orientation is not really solid, we will be suffering from it, all of us, the people. And in the US, we have managed to put together a real anti-imperialist coalition of all forces. This coalition against US foreign military bases is one example of it, but we have more. We have anti-sanctions coalition. We have other coalitions that are working in tandem with each other on various organizations. And for the first time in a long time, at least the anti-imperialist front within the US peace movement is united. So we are hoping to have much better results in the future with our additional work. I would like to thank everybody, especially comrades in COSI who helped us organize this, the World Peace Council who helped organize this, and looking forward to additional work. And don't forget, we were planning to have an international anti-imperialist conference in Cyprus. It is still on, although the COVID-19 has pushed it back from March 2020 to August 2020, and then now, hopefully, we are hoping to organize it as soon as COVID situation allows. So please look at our website, cyprus-conference.org. All the information will be there and updates will be there for the upcoming conference, that we should really focus on the heart of the whole problem that we are dealing with, which is imperialism. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Greetings to all.
Thank you.